Thanks for coming to our session today. This is an event organized by the Center for Global Management. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Sebastian Edwards. I am the Senior Associate Dean for Global Initiatives here at Anderson. And I am extremely proud and happy to have these three superstars today with us. And we think we're going to have a really excellent discussion. So let me introduce the panel very quickly. And then I'll say very few words, and then we'll open it up. We're going to have a round where the three panelists will make a very brief initial statement or presentation. And then if they clash, I'll let them fight it out. We cannot let the opportunity for a good fight go by. If they don't clash, then we'll open it up and you ask really hard questions so that they do clash. Okay? So we have Professor Chris Tang, one of our superstars. He's going to be talking mostly about Hong Kong, and he is very knowledgeable about almost everything. Underlying almost, huh? And he has been very instrumental in one of our most beautiful programs, which is our joint MBA program with the National University of Singapore. We have Professor Christine Loh. She is by training a lawyer, and she has been she has had important senior positions in the government of Hong Kong, and she has come to us recently and has been teaching some courses that are fascinating on ESG and on the interplay between politics, the public sector, and the private sector. And if you haven't taken her courses, I recommend that you do. And then we have Professor Romain Wacziarg, another of our superstars. He is from LA, and from India, and from France. So he's from everywhere, right? He's a true cosmopolitan. And if you haven't taken his courses, I strongly recommend that you do. So we're going to have mostly or exclusively Hong Kong. Then we're going to move to Rome, Paris, and then Hong Kong. So we're going to have Paris squeezed in between two Hong Kongs. So let me just very briefly as an introduction to this. When the subprime, you guys were not born yet, but when the subprime crisis erupted in 2008, 2009, Mohammed El-Erian, who was the number 2 guy at PIMCO, and then he became the number 1, and then now he's like even more than 1, I don't know, number 0, I guess. So Mohammed coined the term the new normal. And he said there's a new normality in the world financial markets and in the world. And he described it in mostly or not or exclusively in economic terms. And one way to think about the new normal from the perspective of Mohammed El-Erian is that we have 0 interest rates in a number of countries. So it's economics. And today, the Financial Times had a heading saying, because of the scare of the coronavirus, the value of bonds that have negative yields have once again gone above $1 trillion. Right? So again, a new normal with super low interest rates, it's economics. But then we have this new normal on the social scene, where everywhere we are seeing disruption, social upheaval, demonstrations, for reasons that are both different and specific, but also that are connected with each other. If you look at videos, at short videos, say 30-second videos, you will not be able to tell apart, in particular Hong Kong and Chile, for instance. They have the same aesthetics, the same language. There's the first line, there's the second line of protesters. France is a little different. It's not, but maybe not. So this is what we're going to find out. So the question is, this new normal seems to also affect the social fabric of society. And what we would like to discuss then with our guests, or with our panelists, they are not guests, they are all members of the family, with our panelists is how this new normal can be understood and how does it affect us as students of management and you as future leaders in around the world. So without any further to say, let me now turn to Chris Tang.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Before I start, maybe I first tell you a little bit about my background so that you know why I'm on this panel. So first of all, I want to thank Sebastian and Lucy for organizing this wonderful panel, very timely topic. And when they invited me, I said I'm delighted to join the panel, and also especially with my dear friends Christine and Romain. First of all, I want to tell you that like Christine, we're both born in Hong Kong. We're both educated in the UK, and then we're both now teaching here. So, but she has a much better job. I was just low on the totem pole. But actually, we both study, work in Hong Kong, and also that I also study in the UK, and also work in Singapore and also Los Angeles. So, before I really dig into the detail about what the underlying causes, what are the implications? Maybe I just spend just a few minutes to give you the backdrop. There's some historical perspective. Then maybe we can turn over to Christine, then we can continue the discussion. So I think that would be more interesting. Would that be all right? Yeah. So let me start it with, in terms of the background, just make the story short, because I want to make it short. Let me use a metaphor. I thought about how to explain the situation in Hong Kong in simple words without really starting from the 18th century, right? So think about two parents. Two parents, I'm not going to use gender, just two parents. And two parents, they engage in a war, okay? That war is the Opium War. And one parent lost. And then there was a treaty in Nanjing. And the treaty is that the children, two children, the first child is Hong Kong and part of Kowloon, was ceded to one parent, which is Great Britain, in perpetuity. The treaty is forever. But then the child get lonely, like Adam. They said, well, we need a second child. Then it's okay, the second child's on loan. It's okay, we'll give you a second child. The second child is new territory. That one is the lease for 99 years. So then fast forward to 1984, and the Britain realized the lease is coming up soon. Then you have to talk to another parent. Okay, do you want to keep the two child? The custody problem. So they signed the joint agreement, the joint declaration, the Sino-British joint declaration in 1984, about 1997. Then at the time, Margaret Thatcher did try to negotiate. Can they keep Hong Kong and Kowloon as part of UK, to keep it that way? But on the other hand, the other parents said, well, if you want to do that, maybe the trade could be a problem. Then, upon evaluating the pros and cons, UK decided to return the entire Hong Kong, Kowloon, New Territories back to China in 1997. Now, as these parents are leaving, these parents try to sign a deal that is, well, when I'm no longer looking after my children, can you ensure that they will continue have the autonomy, the freedom of press, freedom of expressions, to continue for 50 years. So that was the Joint Declaration 1984. Then I think that was the key thing. But then the citizen, the children, like the people in Hong Kong, at one time they were parents under the British influence, the British history, and also that more freedom. But then all of a sudden there's a new parent came in. The new parent came in, they tried to influence the rule. He said, well, that is the old parents. I'm the new parents. Now you have to behave differently. So that's the problem. Look at me, right? Do I look like the obedient type? That is a problem, all right? So in that case, that creates some of the animosity, and that's a new generation is different. So I'm going to stop here, and then I just want to turn over to Christine, then we can continue dialogue. Yes. Now, but before that, we have not coordinated about what we're going to discuss tonight, or the gloves are off, but no matter what we say, we're friends.
Okay, so I had planned to have Romain now, but I think given what Chris said, is that okay, Romain, if we go to Christine? Yeah, so we're going to go to Christine. Are you obedient, Christine? Because Chris recognized publicly that he's not. He's a rebel.
He's just raised the question to make it provocative. So he's provocative. Whether he's a good boy or not, we have to wait and see.
Okay. Maybe he's just mouth, big mouth.
Yeah. How many of you are from Hong Kong? Anyone here from Hong Kong? No. Anyone from China? Okay. All right. The Hong Kong, I presume you're here because the Hong Kong story has somehow, you've seen it on the media, there are hundreds and thousands, maybe a couple of million people on the street. We're a small city. To squeeze in, so many people, it's truly amazing. And how is it that a city goes from one day to the next? Peaceful, and then suddenly there are enormous crowds and protests that has continued from essentially early June. So one observation, and I think at this stage, I'm not going to go into the step-by-step, the government then responds and the protesters want this and that. I don't think I'll take that track. But what I want to do is to respond to some of the images and questions that you may have looking at a big protest. And I think, Sebastian, you raised the issue of new normal, this kind of thing. It's happening in different parts of the world. They seem to have certain similarities. So what might be the Hong Kong story? And I think we can look at Europe and you'll see whether there are any similarities. So the way I look at it as a Hong Kong person, I lived through it. I arrived in Hong Kong the day that we were supposed to have had 2 million people on the street. And between early June and mid-December, I was back in Hong Kong 6 or 7 times. I don't know how you feel about your hometown. There is a certain deep affection and connection, I presume. Certainly, I feel it. And of course, some cities, it's really made you who you are. And for me, because I was in politics, I was in business in Hong Kong, I feel Hong Kong has made me who I am. And I'm partly Chinese and I'm partly British, you could say. These were the factors that collided in my life. So if you were to say to yourself, what's your identity? Where does your identity come from? I think this is a very important question to ask. The people who are protesting in different parts of the world, what are they protesting? So that's sort of one question. Now in Hong Kong, I think certainly the issue of identity is very important, and Chris Tang has sort of set it up. This, you're torn between being Chinese, you're torn between the history, the colonial history, and our forefathers, they all talked about the compelling and history of China being given a hard time by the West. And I think even today, we're still talking about, what is the US-China conflict really about? Okay, there's economy and technology and so on, but deep down, I think on the Chinese side is, well, I was the underdog and I really want to catch up. And for generations of Chinese, we've been saying, well, China's rise, what does it really mean? We want China to do better. So it is kind of here, it is doing better, but in terms of its culture its political systems, its practices, it's opposite to the Western system. So if you're in Hong Kong, you're kind of tutored to think about capitalism, the market, liberal society, whereas the narrative in China, it's more about society as a whole, more authoritarian, more centralized power. You know, these things are a real conflict within ourselves, the people in Hong Kong. Now, then, if we look at some of the things that happen when millions of people are in the streets, well, first of all, the new normal is it's really picked up around the world very quickly. We're looking at, protesters are looking at each other and saying, gee, you know, that was cool that they did. So, for example, Hong Kong's airport, it's one of the major airports in the world. For 2 days, we had to close down the airport in August. I mean, this was unbelievable. In Hong Kong, we could not conceive that this would happen because people, well, actually, I think the protesters didn't know that would be the consequence because a group of them flooded into the airport and somehow the airport couldn't function and it decided to close down and it ended up closing down for 2 days. So there are costs involved, enormous inconvenience and so on. But a little bit later in Spain, because right now in Catalonia, people want independence, and they thought it was a cool thing, and they shut down. Somehow the protesters ended up shutting down the airport there for a day. So what I'm saying is there is this copycat nature, and it's possible to draw inspiration, you could say, from other protesting groups today. I mean, people are copying each other on all kinds of things. So why not protest? Why not messages? Why not anything that you think is cool? So that's another factor, the copycat factor, and the speed of copying each other because of social media. The other thing is there is clearly around the world, definitely in Hong Kong, an anti-government, an anti-establishment sense. You know, so this sense that is going around the world, and maybe you want to ask yourselves, what gets you going about the establishment? You know, might it draw you out on something where you live or in your country or in your town? And if you can imagine that you're out there on some protest and social media, you're going, you know, people are saying things with placards and smart little logos and so on, we're all at it. So this kind of common, sort of comradeship amongst protesters and amongst protesters across cultures and country is a new phenomenon. Now, if we were to bring it back down to kind of an Anderson issue, when we talk about a new normal, our businesses and organizations, so I'm not even talking about governments. Governments clearly have to deal with this. And I'll stop here, just on this last point. Is the new normal a major non-market risk for many, many societies?
Okay, that's a great question to end with, Christine, and we'll move to Romain. But I was quite impressed by something that you said, and I think it's going to connect well with Romain's presentation on the protests in Paris. You said that we haven't seen this copycat thing in the past. I was alive. It's hard for me to recognize it, but I was alive in 1968. And 68 was a big, big copycat. It started in Paris, and maybe by coincidence, one can even argue it started in 67 at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. But Paris, Berkeley, Buenos Aires, the big massacre in Tlatelolco in Mexico. So we have seen in the past, without social media, some sort of copycat. So maybe, of course, you're right that now it's easier, but maybe it's a political cycle where there are things that are really truly global in the sense that are making people from different. So Paris 68, Paris 2018, Romain, tell us
Well, first of all, Sebastian, thank you very much for moderating, and Lucy for organizing, and my co-panelists for being here. Sebastian, when you said you were alive at that time, I thought you were going to say 1848.
Yeah,
Because
I was.
that was actually the first instance, perhaps, where you had revolutions all over Europe, Germany, Austria, France, etc., that were sort of, I wouldn't say coordinated, but happened to happen at the same time. And they're known as the revolutions of 1848. There's a Wikipedia page, you can look it up.
Yeah, well.
And so it's not...
the defenestration started there.
Yes.
That's the term.
Yes.
Started in 1848, which is a beautiful term, right? To throw someone
out the window.
Out the window. The tax collectors, they were thrown out the window in Vienna, right?
So France has had a long tradition of protests going back even before that. There were tax revolts in the French countryside under Louis XIV. Of course, the French Revolution was the start of a big set of mass protests, 1848. The Commune of Paris, 1870. The student revolts of 1968. And now we have the yellow vests in Paris, but I'm skipping a lot, in between of the sort of French national pastime to protest and to go in the street. And I think there's two distinctions. One is protests tend to be lumpy in time, so they tend to happen for reasons that are sometimes a little bit mysterious. So, Christine mentioned that in Hong Kong, the underlying factors were this disconnect between the institutions of Hong Kong and the institutions of the mainland. Then one day were going to erupt, and the specific reason was the extradition law. And in France, very much the same way, there's an undercurrent of discontent with the elites, and there was a small reason for it to erupt, and it was increasing the fuel tax, which some people, particularly in rural areas of France, where they have to commute for a long time, felt that was deeply unjust, that suddenly this regressive tax was being put on them. People of modest means, spend a lot of their budget on fuel, and that kind of fueled the protest. It was the trigger, which was a small trigger that led to a massive social event. And so there's lumpiness in time, and there's also this observation that Christine made about the fact that you tend to see these things correlated over space. So you'll see a protest in France, and it will have contagion effects elsewhere. And we've seen this in other instances, for example, during the Arab Spring in 2011, where it started in Tunisia and it spread throughout the Arab world pretty much everywhere, and led to some pretty dramatic effects, if you think of what happened in Syria, for example, since then. But and so in France, you might think about 2019 very much in this vein. France was one of the first countries to experience these massive protests. It was actually in 2018 that it started, in October 2018. And if you look at there's actually a Wikipedia page, I looked it up, on the protests of 2019. And it's, they call it the mass protests of 2000. There's different words. The mass protests of 2019, the global protest wave of 2019, you name it. And so there's this aspect of both, it's hard to predict where a protest is going to happen at a given point in time. A small trigger can generate it. And it's also hard to predict where it's going to spread, because it spreads through social media, through other means of communications, and seemingly in a very chaotic way. So for you, as business leaders, et cetera, the main thing here is the unpredictability of it. I think in the French case, it was never going to work. And in fact, the Yellow Vest movement in France ended up in a spectacular failure, would be my diagnosis of what happened, partly because nobody within the movement could agree on even a simple set of common goals. So it started out as a tax revolt. It morphed into something about social justice. Some people on the fringes of the movement, particularly the far right, tried to turn it into an anti-immigration movement. And you had, on some counts, over 40 demands that people made. Some of them political. Some people argued that there should be more direct democracy in France. And so because they couldn't agree on goals, and then whenever someone would spring up as a leader, they would shoot that person down for wanting to be too organized. They were very disorganized, and as a result of having no goals and no organization, they slowly petered out, and only the extremists were left in the end, and they did things like anti-Semitic comments and things like that that discredited them, and the movement ended up sort of dying. Even though I think officially they still think they're alive, so you'll see 2 or 3 yellow vests on the weekends in Paris. But it hasn't had any the social significance that I think the Hong Kong movement may have had.
Let's go one more round, I think, before we open up. Chris wants to go back. And if you guys can answer Christine's last question, is this a non-market risk for companies around the world and how to deal with it? I think that that's the key question in this setting. So Chris, why don't we go back to you?
Okay. First, I want to respond to Roman's question. Is this protest predictable? That's the thing. So I did look at some maybe coincidence. I looked at what triggered different protests around the world. Hong Kong, Lebanon, Chile, France, okay? And take France, France is always protesting, so it's an outlier, so I put it aside, right? But if you look at in terms of Chile, the protest events does not occur that often. Lebanon once in a while, Hong Kong is not common. So Christine made a very good point. I visited Hong Kong maybe 4 times a year, and the last time was just 2 weeks ago. And at the airport, actually I cried. I was born there, and I saw the economic development was phenomenal during my lifetime. I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime. Do you agree? Right. Then the question, what triggered these people to do that? To destroy their own home, right? We see that, right? So then I was thinking that they look at the income inequality. Let's think about it. Hong Kong is one of the richest cities in the world. You'll be surprised, okay? The number of high net worth individuals, more than $30 million, actually Hong Kong is the number 1 in the world, 10,000, versus New York City. New York City is 9,000, point number 1. Point number 2 is the measure of income inequality, Gini index. Among all the developed economies, Hong Kong is again number 1. Third, in terms of, I look at the property cost and income ratio. This is the average property price versus your median income. Again, it's number 1. It takes 47 years.
To do what?
To own a property of the average size.
Oh, I'm 2 years away.
47 years.
In 2 more years, I'll be a homeowner.
Yeah. The average cost is $3,000 per square foot. All right, 3,000. The number 2 is Singapore, 2,000. New York City is around 15,000, 1,500. All right. So then you can think about the skew of the income is very extreme. Now, Hong Kong is a free market, just like United States. And I just read the book to prepare for this panel. And the book is written by Joe Stiglitz as a Nobel Prize winner from Columbia University. And in his book, he has a conjecture, if you will. He truly thinks that the free markets should be put into question in terms of equality, in terms of fairness, in terms of social justice. So I think that triggered some of these protests in many countries. Hong Kong is one of them. Lebanon is another one of them. It's triggered by the tax on WhatsApp. Because people, they don't have a lot of money, they use the WhatsApp as a way of communication. When they charge the extra tax, that's when the protest. It's the trigger because the government failed to deliver the social contracts. Because they expect the country will continue to do well. Same thing about Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, they said, well, before it's under the British government, maybe they don't understand our needs. So now they're gone. So now we have a local government who actually, same age as me, born in the same region, went to school next to my school, all right? So we said that, wow, this is so wonderful. I met Sir Carrie in March last year. Fantastic. She delivered excellent speech. But then all these things trigger one thing, one episode, next. But what the citizen, what the residents was hoping for is better housing programs, better social welfare programs, helping the elderly folks. But somehow the government appears to focus on other things that is not what they need. So one thing led to another. There are a lot of warning signs because most of the time, people in Hong Kong, they are not the troublemaker. I was a troublemaker, but they're not.
You still are.
I'm still are. That's why I never deny. So that the question is that is, so the warnings, but the government did not do public consultations well enough. They did not understand the ground. Now Singapore is much better. They have a REACH program for every single ministry. They do reach out the grassroots because they were elected. That's also trigger about the movement about the voting, the universal suffrage, which is unlikely to happen. But on the other hand, that's the questions, what to do, what trigger all this. So right now, Lebanon has a new government. It's still not working because they have 18 sects. They have a different position for different type. For example, the Prime Minister has to be Christian, and also the Speaker of the House to be Muslim. So they have different type of sect to fill the positions. So they never really have a common voice, common goal to meet the people's need. So I think that all these protests could be triggered, could be predictable if they actually consult the public opinion more often, listen to the ground, and also to deliver the social contract in a more effective manner. So I think that could make a big difference.
Okay, thanks, Chris. A couple of things here. I think you are definitely into something, and we'll get our panelists. You should not read Joe Stiglitz that often, though. But let me come back to the whether this is. Of course, we know that it's happening everywhere, and we still need to answer Christine's question. We cannot forget it. But I think, Chris, that the issue of inequality is true, but it's much more complicated than that. So Hong Kong has one of the highest inequality indices in the world. So those of you who have taken my class, the Gini coefficient in Hong Kong is 54, which is one of the highest in the world. France is stable at 33,
Yes.
which is a remarkable low Gini coefficient. And if we can calculate this index of inequality, the lowest, the less unequal it is, before taxes and after taxes. So before taxes and transfers in France is like Hong Kong. And then the French have a system of taxes and transfers that lower it to 33, which is one of the lowest in the world. Chile, the other country that you mentioned, or one of the two, has, but declining. It went from 54 to 44, while Hong Kong went from 44 to 54. So here we have Hong Kong high and higher, Chile high but down, France low and stable, and still we have all this mess. So there's something, I agree with you, but there is something else. Christine.
Well, very difficult to explain, but there's obviously a sort of perception of unhappiness. And it's obviously driven by many things, and it's not for me to go into this very complex issue. But going back to the question, Sebastian, that you asked, this new normal, I think one of the things that business do have to think about is when people are highly polarized, will they drag business into it? Now, what we see in Hong Kong is extraordinary. So the protesters are bashing up Starbucks because the license for Starbucks is held by a company whose original owner's daughter, who's no longer running the company, said something against the protesters. And she is perceived to be connected to China. This particular group, they run restaurants. So they also have a chain of various Chinese restaurants. So these are being bashed up. They also have a license from a Japanese fast food company. Those are being bashed up. So now, right now, it's anti-China, you could say. Never mind about the brand, but they're being bashed up because of the owners. Now, can you conceive of a situation maybe in a part of the world that you know, where somehow political polarization is going to start pinpointing businesses, brands, or ownership that somehow is seen by at least one group to be politically incorrect? Can you foresee that happening? So
Germany
again,
in 1933.
well, it's
I'm
rather,
sorry to remind you of
well,
that.
the reason I'm going there is if you take this down the road and identify the cases in time, it's rather scary.
It is very scary. Yeah.
But the point that I really want to make is about polarization. The polarization can be so deep in a society and could come so fast. I think that the thing that hurts me, that breaks my heart in Hong Kong, is watching my community of what Chris, maybe you too, right? You kind of imagine, okay, well, we're pretty moderate people. But wow, maybe no. Maybe if something comes into a society, and Hong Kong is just an example, it is possible that within a matter of months, people can be so polarized that relations in the family, with your friends, amongst colleagues, could really break down on political lines. And then who do you go after next? Because you have these rather unruly, the sort of more radical wing of the protesters looking for something to vandalize, to make a political point. So this is, again, something that we're seeing in Hong Kong that is very, very specific to Hong Kong, and rather scary. Now, the last point I want to make about this is, well, these things are being bashed up. Our MTR, this is our subway. It's one of the best subways in the world. 90% of our subway stations have been vandalized. And it's not just bashing up, the facade and the windows. It's bashing up all kinds of facilities, including throwing things onto the rail lines and, bashing up turnstiles.
Have they closed the metro?
Again, they had to close for several days because of the widespread destruction. Now, I'm only talking about...
Now, this one I need to interrupt you for a second,
Yeah.
all right? Then we have to think about why did it happen, right? So to be fair to the protesters. So what happened is one of the events happened in one of the MTR stations. The protesters felt that when there's another group to beat up the protesters, but somehow the subway station staff did not really help them, did not try to settle the issues. So they thought the interpretation, the impression was that the subway staff members, they're not supporting them.
They are in cahoots with the bad guys.
Right,
Huh?
so they think it's a part of the revenge. So that's why the action-reaction, that's why it is become endless. That's why I classify the situation that if we continue this way, it's going to be endless. Reminds me of those Chinese martial art movie. Your parents killed my parents, so now I have to learn my kung fu to fight you, right? So I said this will be endless. Let's not go there. So, but I just
Let's all move to Paris.
yes. So
Okay,
that's why I
let's
will
go
try
to Romain.
to change it. Yeah.
Okay, Roman, go back to Paris. But listen, I really need someone to answer Christine's question.
Yeah, so maybe
How should individual companies or the private sector react to this? I mean, maybe it's a tsunami that
Just say you're
to Paris.
Starbucks. You're Starbucks in Hong Kong.
Move to Paris.
That's
huh? Okay, Roman.
Well, I'm more optimistic on how it affects business. I mean, 2019 was the year of the great wave of protests, and around the world, possibly not Hong Kong, I haven't looked, but the stock markets have done very, very well. So it looks like, at least if you look at it as
Yeah,
an
but
event
that's because
study,
of zero interest rates.
maybe.
Income divided by R, that's valuation. Huh?
I'm good.
And
I'm
Hong
good with
Kong
that,
stock
but-
market has been up.
So you know,
Earnings divided by the
so
cost of capital.
the market is telling us that it's not such a huge deal, and I think the reason is it tends to be, very present in the media, but geographically it's relatively contained. It's not the case that 193 countries out of 193 countries have experienced protests. The protests were episodic in about 20 countries, 1 out of 10 in 2019, and it was one of the records. So of course, this is all depends on how you define a protest, et cetera, but some of the standard definitions suggest that. So, for example, in France, the effect of the Yellow Vest movement on GDP has been, I mean, I think according to everyone, you know, the Yellow Vests were only happening on Saturdays because people had to drive in from the province. It was not disruptive.
He interrupted Christine. I'm going to interrupt you.
Yeah, please.
I was quite surprised when you said it was a failure and it's off. I then think the Financial Times must be run by a whole bunch of Brits who hate France because they keep saying that it's very much alive, that the protest over the pension reform...
yeah, but that's totally different.
It's la même chose, come on.
No.
There are people very upset with the establishment.
Actually, I think the protest of the pension is much more serious than the Yellow Vests. Because it's led by unions, and it's led by unions who have the power to bargain with the government.
The transportation strike was supposedly ended today. Yeah. It was 5 weeks of no transportation in Paris.
It was the longest transportation strike in the history of France. But that's not the Yellow Vest movement. The
Yellow Vest is the metaphor. It's this upheaval, the protest, it's not... I mean, is this a new normal of social upheaval that companies should take into account?
But I think it would be dangerous to put everything in the same bucket. Like the Yellow Vest protest was more akin to a spontaneous, unpredictable protest like you've seen maybe in Chile or Hong Kong, etc. The strike against the pension reform in France was completely predictable. It has happened every time someone wants to do a pension reform in France, and I would say it's failing too. So the government's is going to push this pension reform through. They have the political capital to do it in the Parliament and the French National Assembly, and the strike has ended. So this was one instance where the Macron government or administration held firm. When pretty much every other reformist government in the last 30 years had surrendered to the unions. But it was really a fight between the unions and the government, a very traditional fight that goes back to the Second World War. It's very different, I think, from the Yellow Vest movement, which was much more of a grassroots, bottom-up movement.
We're going to open up. We'll have plenty of time to go back to the panel. Okay. Let's open up for questions in the room, and we also have a device that has never worked before, but will work today, and we're going to get questions from all over the world. Okay, so but let me start with questions here from the floor. Don't be shy. This is an amazing opportunity. Raise your hand. Okay, let's start over there. Yeah. Do we have mics?
And my question really is it's great that all this revolution and protesting is happening with people expressing their views, but how long can we expect mainland China to allow this to go on?
Okay, that's a heavy one. So my preference always is to get 2 or 3 questions and then have the whole panel. But this is such a heavy one that we're going to allow the panel to answer that one. Hopefully in just like 3 weeks and 2 days or something like that. How long could this go on, Chris?
I would not know.
Okay.
But I think right now China is busy with something else.
Something else.
It's coronavirus. So I think that in terms of the situation is very complicated because it's not just China, it's also involved the US human rights laws and all this. So it's much more complicated. So I really cannot say.
I think I would just say that China has been incredibly restrained. Now, but I think the underlying question you're asking is, this has got to stop in China. Isn't it going to do something terrible, right? Well, what if China's position is, okay, we'll take a minimalist approach, which is what they've done so far. But right now, as Chris said, there's the coronavirus. And I think the coronavirus on Hong Kong is going to make governing Hong Kong even more difficult. The issue that happens in Hong Kong right now is because there is distrust on the government itself, on its capability to deal with crisis, I don't think that the coronavirus is actually good for Hong Kong. It's not going to bring Hong Kong people together. It might make people even more dissatisfied with the government.
Romain, you want to add something about China?
Well, I mean, I think I actually think, I'm kind of on the side here because the situation in China strikes me as much more serious than the situation in France. It's not just the protests in Hong Kong, it's the way it is, it takes place in the context of growing conflict between the US and China for preeminence in a variety of geopolitical things. China being a country that is much too rich to still be an autocracy. So I've done work on how you should expect countries, political regimes to evolve over the development process. And China is really due for some democratic reforms, and they won't be easy and they won't be peaceful when they happen because of the particular setting, the size of the population, the extent of the autocratic, how would I say, of the dictatorship, of the oppression that exists. And so I think it needs to be seen in this bigger context. Typically, big political upheavals result from small events. Perhaps the Hong Kong protests might be the trigger, or maybe the coronavirus would be the trigger, or a combination of the two, or that plus pressure from the US. But there's a sense so that the Chinese regime is being besieged a little bit from many fronts. So.
Okay, so
I guess it sounds like most of you have been reacting to this question of how business leaders react to and respond to this political and social environment. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what it could look like for a business leader to interrogate the role of business in creating the status quo that many people are reacting to, or potentially at least in benefiting from this environment, and how people who are becoming business leaders can really think about their role in these systems and what it looks like for a business to be a part of that conversation.
Okay, great question. Let me accumulate a couple of more. We need questions from this side now. Yes. Here.
Just wanted to see if Professor Wacziarg can finish his thoughts on protests in the world.
Okay, so again, the generalization. Another one from this end.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, yes.
I have a question. So a majority of the protesters in Hong Kong are mainly young kids, college students, that are entering the workforce over the next couple of years. I know you mentioned, one of you guys mentioned that the economy in Hong Kong is currently growing, but how do you see that shift in the next couple of years when these kids are going to be the future consumers, the future workforce, and what impact that may be in Hong Kong?
Okay, so we're going to start now with Romain. And I want to add to this last question, do they care? I mean, one notion is that the newer generations, they just don't care about the metro stations being nice or not, and they burn them, and don't care if they get a job or not. I mean, is there a huge generational change? There was a study by Deutsche Bank that we teach in our classes about behavioral finance and behavioral economics. You nudge people to do things. Apparently here you nudge them, they do nothing, the new generation. You push them and they still don't react. And you can bang them on the head and they don't react. It's a different frame of mind. So finish and try to react to everything that has been said.
No, that's tough now. I'm in a tough spot. I think generalizations are very difficult. I think what you pointed out about the different levels of income inequality, for example, suggests that there's not a simple answer to say whenever inequality has increased, then you get protests. Similarly, the demographic issue that you just raised is also one in which generalizations are difficult. If you look at the typical yellow vest movement protester in France, it's a middle-aged man, like in the late 40s, So that's very different.
On a tractor, huh? Driving a tractor.
Sometimes on a tractor and driving cars, so it can't be. But I think in very different contexts, particularly in developing countries, you'll see very different demographics of the protesters. So the only generalizations I think you can make is that there tends to be contagion. When someone sees a protest about a political grievance somewhere, let's say Hong Kong, then they take that and they make it about their own grievance in their own country. They adapt it to their own circumstance. Social media plays a role. the success of protests has played a role. So if you look actually historically, I was looking at this today, there's a professor at Harvard, Erica Chenoweth, who specializes in studying protests. She's quite an activist herself. If you look at her webpage, it's pretty out there. I recommend a visit. But what she observed was that if you take the period between 1940 and 2010, and you look at mass protests, or really the big ones, like the one in Hong Kong, etc., about 50% of them resulted in the leader of the country being deposed, which I found was a huge number. Like, I didn't think it would be that big. When you start to read the cases, it kind of makes sense. It starts with Gandhi in India, et cetera, et cetera. That's gone down lately, but it's still pretty large share of the protests that actually lead to what you would call leadership turnover or leadership change. And so if it's that successful and you see it happen in Hong Kong, why not imitate it where you are and hope that it works as well? But the underlying causes are unbelievably different from place to place, and that's, I think, the main difficulty in trying to assess where the next one's going to be. But I think mostly they're localized, they're very visible in the media, but they don't have hugely disruptive effects on economies. They could have hugely disruptive effects on specific firms, against which protests are directed. But I think, at least the way you look at the stock markets around the world in this year of record protests, there were also record stock markets. It seems that they haven't had a big effect on companies. But I think the question you ask on the responsibility of companies is a more fundamental one because it goes to the long run. I don't really. I think we should probably organize another panel just on this very question of how we should change the way we do business in response to public discontent and in particular the rise of populism.
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, and I'll take both that question and what you said. And I don't know what the right answer is, I'll say. China is going to buck your trend. At least this is what they're saying. Right? Your study is to say, well, you come to a certain level, you've got to change. You've got to be more this and more that. China is saying, I'm not going down that path, but I'm trying to create a different kind, call it a social contract, because that's how we understand the language, create a new social contract with our people, and we're going to have different tools, but it's going to be more centralized and more authoritarian and so on. So they're going to try and buck your trend. Secondly is, in Hong Kong, for example, and one of the things that has created a lot of inequality is land and property prices. As Chris explained, right, the land prices. It's very hard to own a piece of property in Hong Kong. What China has indicated to the richest group of people in Hong Kong, which are the property developers, is to say, well, people are suffering. I'm paraphrasing, right? They use kind of more stilted language, but what it means is, well, people are suffering. You're holding a lot of land. How about doing some deal with the government? We're not going to take the land away from you, but, we can buy, the government can buy the land, and there'll be more land to build more low-income housing, right? So if you're looking at it from China's perspective, they are clearly seeing, and they do understand, what are some of the social inequalities in Hong Kong. Now, for them, they believe it's the social inequality that is driving people's discontent. The part that is much more difficult, I think, for China to deal with is the people have a different sense of values from the Chinese system, and this is what is not bridging. And this is what is creating the polarization. But there are socioeconomic problems on the ground that has to be dealt with, but when nobody trusts the government, when people are concerned about the sovereign power in Beijing, I don't know what's the common ground that we have to start discussing these solutions. So people want the solutions, they don't like the leaders, they don't like how the leaders are chosen, and this becomes a barrier itself to discuss the problems that they want to solve.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me first respond to James' question earlier on in terms of the protesters. They're not only the young people, also old people also join the protest. Percentage is smaller because the population is smaller, more younger people there. But anyway, I did actually interact with some of the protesters. They are university students because I do visit the different universities. And as Christine mentioned, they are the new generation. It is a new normal because they said they don't care if whether they found a job or not. At least that's what they told me. They don't care if the economy is tanking or not. And then I said, well, why? Somehow, the Hollywood is become too successful. They gave me a quote. I did not know the quote. He said that you should remember the quote from Hunger Games. Hunger Games. If we burn, you burn with us. Okay? Then I have to try to Google, try to understand what that meant, right? So it's a very different mindset, right? But I think that is not going to resolve the problem. What Christine said, the social contract is being put in question in Hong Kong. Now, I did do the comparisons between Hong Kong and Singapore. They're both former British colonies. Now, in Singapore, the public housing, the HDB flats, 80% of the population live in subsidized or managed kind of housing. In Hong Kong, it's only 30%. The rest, the most people, they spend more than 50% of the income to find a place to live. So that is very extreme. So the Chinese government is becoming aware of this problem. That has to change. Now, then the question about the political issues, that I don't think can be easily addressed. But we learn in business school, we learn when the negotiation failed, what do you do? We learn that in the negotiation class, is a concept called partner. It's the best alternative in terms of negotiation agreements. So that means you cannot negotiate, you negotiate something else. So when the social contract break down, that also linked into the business community, all right? Now in Hong Kong, do you know that the tax rate is the lowest in the world, corporate tax, 16.5. Now individual income tax, 17%. So they actually have the corporate tax lower than the personal income tax. Second, 0 sales tax. Third, 0 capital gain tax. Now, what this tax policy, who does it benefit? I don't need to explain to you. So the younger people say, I have no assets. I have no very low income.
I don't buy anything.
Yes, they don't buy anything. Right, so they live at home, right? But the question is in order to get the business start going again, because the economy is really suffering in Hong Kong. The hotel industry, the occupancy rates went down to 40%. Now with the coronavirus, even lower. Louis Vuitton, some of the shops are closed because there's no business for the last 6 months. It's not possible, right? So the job opportunities even going down further. And also some of the high net worth individuals, they shift some of the investment to Singapore because it's more stable. So I think this is where the free markets cannot really kickstart. That's where the Hong Kong government can play a role, right? So in a way that I'm quite happy to hear that I think last week, I think Hong Kong government is going to invest 10 billion Hong Kong dollars to help the poor people, but may not be enough. They have to do a little bit more.
That's less than 1 billion? What's it, 14?
Around close to 1.5 billion US dollars.
Yes, 8%.
It's not enough. Hong Kong is rich. They have a lot to reserve. Trust me.
Poco dinero.
Yes, it's little. Yes, poquito. So basically, the challenge is that I think that this is the moment we look for leadership in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong government, to really say that, okay, what you ask some of the demands the protest asked for is not something she can deliver. But the other thing she can. For example, negotiating build more public housing, retirement funds, the MPF fund is a mess. Okay, they have our 401k, but they have 15 different types of institutions to manage it. They have 500 options. So a lot of people are confused. And then who get the benefits are those trustees, like HSBC Bank and all this, because they charge the fees managing. So the poor people, they don't see the things are getting better. So this is where the leadership comes into play. If the Hong Kong government can actually provide it, we hear you, we're going to deliver these kind of social programs so that we have really relieved the burden for the elderly. They don't also build shelters for the homeless people. So I think that when the younger people see the governments actually make the best effort to do, then I think things will be stabilized over time. And then I think that maybe that is where the corporations can also help to do the right thing, to pay a little bit more tax to actually kickstart the economy again.
So the question that I'm going to read here, but there are several along those lines. In the US is also pretty polarized. Why there is no protesting? So that's the question. One could argue that having elected Mr. Trump may be a way of protesting things. But I want to connect this to your question about the corporate sector and try to get the panel to answer the following. Last year, the US Business Roundtable repudiated a 40-year statement of purpose that was based on Milton Friedman's. Those of you in EMBA, in my class, we discussed this on Saturday. So Milton Friedman made his dictum 40 years ago when he said companies have only one obligation, and that is to their shareholders. And all they have to do is maximize shareholder value. That's the only goal that should guide corporations. And last year, the Business Roundtable, and we showed in class on Saturday the signatures of the people that participated. And these are not like unknowns local corporations. This is Apple, American Express, Microsoft. I mean, you name it, they are all there. They said, we now repudiate the shareholder goal and replace it by the stakeholder goal. And they list 4 stakeholders, including the way you ended. Companies should pay a little more to their workers, the community, the environment, and the shareholders now listed number 4. So the question to the panel is to the US, why don't we see more violent, or is it about to happen tomorrow, in which case we'll move all our money to Singapore? And do you think that this changing the statement of the Business Roundtable will make any difference, or is this just blah, 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 just trying to appease people by talking is cheap, right? Okay, so let's start with Romain.
So I've actually looked at the past statements of the Business Roundtable and the current one, and I think it's all blah, blah, blah. Okay. Because the past statements were actually not that different, and when I used to teach business ethics, which is sort of an oxymoron, but
you said 2 things that we're not supposed to say here. China is a dictatorship. That was a no-no.
It is a dictatorship.
Yeah. And that business and ethics don't go together. We're trying to teach these people that they have to go together.
The first one was serious, but the second one was a joke. So the Business Roundtable actually has been issuing these statements on corporate social responsibility since the 80s, and they usually center around the shareholder, but they usually pay lip service to the other stakeholders, the suppliers, the customers, the workers, the environment. Although the environment's not really a stakeholder, because it's like broader than that, I guess. But the thing that's changed, I think, in the latest thing is the order in which they put them, perhaps. So I think that's probably just because they're under tremendous pressure to say something. Whether they're under pressure to say something and then follow that up with actual actions is, I think, what's really the real question here. There was another aspect to this, which was there any protest in the U.S.?
Will there be some?
So one of the most successful protests in the U.S., and I don't mean successful in a normative sense, but in terms of how successful they were electorally, was the Tea Party movement in 2009, which led to the 2010, and there's lots of convincing academic evidence that it led causally to the 2010 wave of Republican wins in the House of Representatives. But even on the other side of the political spectrum, you see women's marches for global warming. So I don't think it's quite the case that there are no protests in the US. They're perhaps more focused on specific issues like global warming or the status of women, or you can think about also the Black Lives Matter movement, which led to many protests, so targeted to issues of justice with respect to the African American community. So I view all of those as sort of part of the same, rising discontent of certain groups or of societies overall.
I think there is a difference in terms of if you're looking at a jurisdiction, you're looking at a big jurisdiction or a small jurisdiction. So if you're talking about Hong Kong and Singapore, these are just cities. So anything that happens has a great impact on the economy for sure. And the stock market, the local stock market, isn't just of Hong Kong companies. It's listed, got other companies. So what I'm saying is the stock market in Hong Kong also does not reflect what's actually happening on the ground. So that's the first point, size. The second point about the US is, and I'm a foreigner watching the US, and I have some questions actually for you. I think you can kind of explain this to me. One is, I see a lot of protest here. As you said, Roman, they're dotted all over the place, many causes, some bigger, some smaller. Now, I don't know whether any of you are watching what's happening in DC. I am. The impeachment trial, that's pretty big politics. But what are Americans really saying to themselves? What's wrong with your political system? Because what I'm trying to do is, do we have to actually see things separately? One is corporate behavior. Obviously, I think today the big corporations are a bit embarrassed. This is the embarrassment of riches. What do we do? How do we share? So the stakeholder ideas are coming forward. ESG reporting, the whole thing about trust is on the table. Now, obviously, this is part of a jurisdiction's social contract as well. But because of globalization, these companies are operating everywhere. How do we look at that? And what can governments do? Now, then you have different political systems. You have the US system. In some ways, mesmerizing watching US politics, because despite the severity of the situation, and that kind of discussion cannot take place in many other parts of the world, but yet the problem that you're having at the top of the government is very serious. So secondly is, if you're some other system of government, China or elsewhere, these issues about corruption, about abuse of power, about social contracts, your attitude in terms of dealing with the people, these are also real political issues. And governing is very difficult, whether you're governing a small city like Hong Kong or a big country like the US or China. These kinds of discussions by the policymakers and the political leadership, they are taking place. The question is, how as a system of government, they're dealing with these issues. China's a very special case, but as an authoritarian, and they tell you, right, this is our system. And in my course, we talk about how you look at different political systems, especially those that are so different from your own. How do you process that information and not just say good, bad? Because when you're saying good, bad, because you can't process, right? Are you using your own as the definition of good? And if we're using, for example, the US definition, obviously you're kind of saying, wow, but there's so many things wrong with my system as well, right? So I think this kind of conversation, how they're having an impact on the ground to a particular business, a particular industry, a particular city. So we don't actually have to always look at big countries, because if you kind of standardize everything, you might say, well, it was terrible for Los Angeles, but it's all right for the rest of the country. That isn't saying very much if you're in Los Angeles. So I think having a different perspective in looking at these issues, and if you're running a business, if you're looking forward, how do you develop the kind of skills or a way of interpretation that will help you to make decisions? Decisions may turn out to be wrong, or some other things happen, and what you did just didn't bring the result that you hoped to have. But nevertheless, I think as business leaders, you want some kind of framework that is broad, that educates you also about political decision making on a big basis, on a small basis, that will help you at least to be able to go forward on something.
Let me say a couple words about the stakeholder from the transition from shareholder value to stakeholder value. So I covered that in my class last night. So basically, I think there's a shift. There is hope. Here's the reason. Before, a lot of business leaders, they can hide behind the scene because they're not exposed, point number one. But then, under pressure, they push for CSR. That started in the 80s. It was a big failure. It's just lip service, just writing report. Nothing happened. But now, things are changing because information, company become more transparent. You know the supply chains. You know whether they have done any bad deeds. You know whether they treat the workers fairly. You know whether they're ethical or not, the supply chain. So because of that, now they feel that they need to change the way they operate. So now there are more companies, they start trying to say that, okay, how can I change the business model such that we can incorporate this stakeholder value, like equal pay for women, in terms of better employment benefits, sustainability, environmental friendly, worker safety issues, embedded in our DNA of our business model, to integrate it into that. And then they try to figure how to create value by doing that. So for example, we should be very proud of the company Patagonia, is headquartered in Oxnard, as basically is they try to inculcate this kind of value. And they can afford to do that because they're privately owned. But now it's more publicly traded company, they start doing that because there is a impact investment fund. There's also a lot of reportings. There are more regulations. So I think that the governments, corporations, and the consumers can work together to build a better ecosystem such that everyone can benefit in this kind of co-development.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions, but let me, Romain and you sort of disagree on whether it's lip service or it has teeth, I think. My personal view is I'm siding more with Chris, even for public companies, because you have entities like ISI and Glass Lewis who are reviewing the 10Ks of public companies. And if you don't have a good governance system, if you don't add women to your board, they recommend you that your shareholders vote against the renewal of the board. So it's getting a lot of traction. I mean, it's not going to be that fast, but I think that there is a lot of hope. So let me open up for more questions from the floor here. Yes.
Thank you all for being here. I was just wondering if you had to pick a country or region that you would say is at kind of heightened risk of having significant protests or turmoil next, what would you say and why?
Wow. Okay, so that's so difficult that we're going to sort of water it down with other questions that maybe I don't know, maybe they're going to be as hard. Yes.
So I guess my question, I agree that having more accountability for businesses seems to be a good thing, but I wonder if this shift away from freedmen has actually less to do with the idea that corporations are suddenly waking up to what their responsibilities are, and actually the extreme change in our legal structure, which has meant that corporations get to influence so much of our government, which has always kind of been there, but is now kind of enshrined in our legal system. So the government doesn't have to work for the people anymore because the government gets to work for business. And so it's quite convenient for business to say, oh, in a very paternalistic fashion, oh, here we're going to give you some better things, rather than having the government actually work for people and the government regulate those businesses so that the businesses could actually look out for their shareholders and not worry about, tripping up all the time over, whatever the protest may be. I think that we look at our businesses to be our government in a lot of ways, and I'm wondering if that's a good forward path.
That's a great question, and I'd like you guys to answer. And it immediately triggered to my mind the corporations say we'll pay more, but the government keeps the minimum wage at $7. But on the other hand, states are raising minimum wages. So in this country, the interplay between state legislation and federal makes it a little bit more complicated. So why don't you guys, we start with Chris, go this way now, addressing these two, which area?
I answered the easy question first.
Okay.
Right? You want to predict the next one. Look at which country has the cost of living, standard of living is declining, and also in terms of the Gini index is increasingly unequal. I think those are the good cases. You can check it online.
Okay, Christine, you're not going to answer the second one about lobbying?
That's too difficult. I leave it to Christine. I told you I am the...
You're just a farm boy, right?
Exactly. Okay.
No, I think that's a really fascinating question, because what is the purpose of government? I think in the U.S., again as a foreigner, my observation is individual, that small government is really important, and because the government is relatively small. You expect the individual and the private sector to do a lot. If you're in Scandinavia, it's different. And I think Americans used to talk about the socialist model, the socialist countries, such as those in Europe, in rather disparaging terms. Right? Because they always tell you what to do. Now, then, with that question is, well, if you think your medical system, if you think your welfare, if you think your public schools, your public infrastructure are not good enough, well, some of those things cannot be done by the corporate sector. They're legitimately the role of government. So, how much taxes you pay and so on, all matters a lot. So my observations, for example, in the US is, greatest country in the world, your infrastructure is not good. Your public infrastructure is actually terrible when you compare it to some of the experiences we have in Asia. Why? Question mark, right? I don't know what the answers are. What do Americans want to do about it? Then I think you have the China model, and China is explicit in saying to you, I'm not going to go down the route of election. Now, election lies at the core of political system, at least of Western type political system. The Chinese say the problem with election is every few years you elect, and the fear is, populists, call them populists, people who are going to promise you all kinds of things that they can't deliver. Now, then you have, let's say, you could say a more mixed model, the Singapore model, where the government starts off by saying, we've got to be very strong, we're going to have elections, but we're going to be really tough to the opposition. So it's a kind of electoral system where the winner is, in a way, the ruling party. But you have elections, and you have to be responsive. They provide a lot of the social benefits that we talked about, housing and good medical, great schools, and so on. But if you read the Western press, Singapore is a bad country because it's not free. Right? So China is saying, well, as it is developing, it's going from great poverty to where it is today, but it's a huge country, so disparity is great. Going forward, it obviously has a lot of ambition. What is that political, social, economic system it wants to develop? And it's saying, we're not ready for elections because it's going to bring those electoral cycles in and so on. Now, so the last thing I want to say about this, and there's no perfect answer to this, is in elections, it's obviously the next government can come in and actually overturn a policy, even a system, like a medical system, the Obamacare. It can throw it away with the next government. This kind of change from one election cycle to the other election cycle is what the Chinese is afraid of. So as I said, no perfect answer, but how you construct the government, how you get things done, who's going to pay for the commons, that means the public infrastructure, public services, and to what extent. And there's no comparison to what governments can do and what even a most powerful company can do. I mean, even when you say Amazon, such a huge company, when you have to take care of the public sector, public services of the country, there's just no comparison. So value your government.
Okay. Romain.
So, well, to answer your question about where's the next hotspot, I think the honest answer to that is I don't know. I'm not aware of any academic work that I would respect that has looked at the determinants of where protests occur and when they occur. And I think the reason there isn't any is because probably when you try, you fail. And it goes to the issue of, the timing is very uncertain because a small thing like a fuel tax can cause it, or a small thing like an extradition law can cause it. And then the location is also very uncertain because it's path dependent. If it starts in Tunisia, then you might get it in Egypt. But if it starts in Chile, then you might get it in Bolivia, or vice versa in this case. But so this lumpiness and this unpredictability of the timing means that I think it's kind of hopeless. If you were to do a regression, you've all done regression, right? Your R squared would probably be like super low, and you wouldn't do a good job. So I think the honest answer is we don't know. And there was another excellent question there. I think that I don't disagree actually that the way corporations conduct themselves is changing, but I think it's just not very new. I think this movement toward privatizing public policy has been going on for a very long time. It's not just the last few years. There's been a movement among the activist community realizing that in the US there was so much gridlock, and the gridlock doesn't date back to just a few years. There's been gridlock in this country for a number of decades now with divided government, was that pursuing policy goals was easier if you targeted corporations directly and put pressure on them because they're in the public eye and they have to respond to, they have to care about their reputation, was better. As I used to bring to my MBA class Mike Brune, who used to run the Rainforest Action Network and now is the executive director of the Sierra Club. And Mike's an activist, but he's very much like an MBA student in terms of he's pursuing strategic goals with purpose, except the strategic goals are not maximizing profit, they're like cleaning up the environment. And he completely internalized the fact that it was hopeless to try to get to Congress and get them to pass modern versions of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. That you were much better going to Citigroup and signing a private contract with them that they wouldn't fund logging in the Amazon. And they did that, in fact, with quite a bit of success. So I think this has been going on for quite a bit of time, and I'm quite optimistic, actually, that it could be a good substitute.
The gender incorporation of women to boards is now Goldman and BlackRock, and we don't have quotas like the Nordic countries.
But it's happening.
It's happening because of exactly of this. We have time for one more question, which is going to be your question.
I was fortunate enough to go on 3 global immersions. We went to South Africa. We experienced xenophobia protests. We went to India with Professor Romain, and we experienced immigration protests. So how does that, we talk about like corporations and their involvement in it, that we really haven't talked about even Brexit. So how does immigration play a role in all the protests around the world, and even Hong Kong? Perhaps you can touch on that.
So not only we didn't talk about immigration, we touched on ethnicity. The discussion about Lebanon, which you mentioned, where we have 2 different groups that try to alternate but it seems to me that in France immigration is a big issue, but in Hong Kong it's not. So
it is.
It is. Okay, so let's start with Christine. We're going to go Christine, Romain, and of course, Chris, you'll have the last word.
I take that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with Christine.
I think the issue about immigration, you normally think of immigration as people coming from outside of a different culture or different religion or different ethnic background. In Hong Kong, the greatest immigration, so to speak, are the people who come from mainland China to live or work in Hong Kong. So whilst we are one race and religion is not an issue, the issue for your typical person in Hong Kong is a really small place, China is huge, and yes, we want tourism, and it was actually after 2003 last year with the first SARS infectious disease that Hong Kong asked mainland China to be more liberal in its granting of tourist visas. So now the thing about China is, well, okay, how many do you want, right? Then for a small place, when we have 7.34 million people who are residents, but the number of people who come from the outside, some are just day trippers, and some are at least spend 1 or more nights, right? It's 60 million people. I mean, that's a staggering number. So even if you take those who obviously come from the neighborhood on the mainland, who are just coming over to do shopping, you're still talking about like 40-something million people a year. So that means your shop, if you're a shopkeeper, who are you going to cater for? Right? So suddenly people from the outside who come, and they come to enjoy themselves, they come to buy things, your city is beginning to cater more for people who come from the outside. So what I'm saying is all these things have been churning also in the background. So for those cities like Hong Kong, the immigration problem is really just a large number of people coming from the outside and changing the dynamics of your city.
Roman.
I think in the case of France, the role of immigration was perhaps more muted in the Yellow Vest movement, except toward the very end when it became quite clear that some parts of the Yellow Vest movement had been co-opted by the extreme right-wing parties of France. And so where that turned into a little more of a reaction against foreigners, Jewish people, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it was a major thing. I think where immigration manifests itself more rather than in protests is in populist voting. So certainly in the United States, but in France also, where the National Front Party is about a quarter of the, gets about a quarter of the votes, and you see it all over Europe, where anti-immigration parties are rising in the polls, and so it manifests itself more at the ballot box, I would say, than in the street at this point.
Okay, well, given this event is hosted by GEM, the global management. So I think that I would end with the notion about globalization. So the issues for like Brexit. I was in London on June 23rd, 2000, on the vote, the night of the vote. Forgot which year it was because it's so long.
2016.
2016. So I did talk with the Remain group. I also talked with the Leave group, and then said, well, what is really the issues? Besides the cultural, political issues, is the economic issues. Because they feel that globalization would actually, has been proven, would suppress the income, the salaries of the local people. Like in Hong Kong. Before, it's a local economy. Once you invite more mainland Chinese come in, they're willing to work at a lower salary. So actually suppress the salary of the people in Hong Kong. Same thing in many countries in Europe. There's a fear that if you allow more Eastern European coming into UK, so the British people, the local residents, they may feel that they're competing with someone who's willing to work harder and also at low wages. So if they feel that it's unfair, so that trigger, that really morph into some kind of resentment. So I think that the question is, what is the goal of globalization? There are good things, and also there should be some negative consequences. That's also happening in the US as well. Then I think that is a question we need to think. Do we think of ourselves as a particular nation, or do we think about as a world? So where do we draw the line? So that is something I don't have an answer. I leave it to you.
Okay, we'll have another meeting. We'll have the same, better food, even better. Thank you so much for coming.